Hey, welcome back to Cool Classics. So when I made my last video on Larry Hovis, it said that he appeared on an episode of Andy Griffith called Goober Takes a Car Apart. I went to watch that, and next thing you know, I went down the George Lindsey rabbit hole, so here's what I learned. He was born George Smith Lindsey, December 17th, 1928 in Fairfield, Alabama. His father was George Ross Lindsey, and his mother was Alice Smith. Most biographies on him say that he was raised by his grandparents, but they don't give an explanation as to why. I did find one interview where he talks about this. He said that he was born right at the beginning of the Great Depression and that his father started having difficulty keeping a job. His mother was also suffering from the bone disease osteomyelitis. He said that's when his grandparents stepped in to help take care of him. So by the time his father landed a full-time butcher's job and the family could be back together, he still was comfortable with his grandparents and spent most of his time there anyway. He said that his grandparents would go take him to see a movie in the evening, and then for the following few days, he was just obsessed with that movie and reenacting scenes from it, and that's probably where he developed his sense of comedic timing. At the age of 14, they took him to go see a musical play called Oklahoma, and he said that just opened up his mind and he knew what he wanted to do. So in high school, he joined the theater group, but he was also on the football team. Upon graduating, he entered Walker Junior College in the same town of Jasper, Alabama, then later transferred to Kemper Military School in Boonville, Missouri. While playing quarterback on their football team, he was contacted by what is now known as the University of North Alabama, and they offered him a full scholarship to come play for their team, so he transferred. While there, he started participating in the school's theater productions, and at one point he got to appear in the musical Oklahoma, which is the one that he went to with his grandparents that started his whole interest in theater. In 1952, he graduated with a bachelor's degree in secondary education and physical education. He then enlisted in the Air Force and was stationed in Orlando, Florida as a recreations director at Pine Castle Air Force Base. While there, he also produced variety shows, performed stand-up comedy, and acted in local theaters. This is where he met his future wife, Joanne Herbert. The two of them would eventually have 2 children together. After 4 years, in 1956, he was honorably discharged and the couple returned to Alabama, where he took a position as a teacher and a basketball coach at Hazel Green High School, just outside of Huntsville. After a couple years of being settled in and having job security, George felt like he still wanted to pursue his dreams of acting. So him and his wife packed up and moved to New York City, where he enrolled in acting classes at the American Theater Wing and studied under legendary actress and teacher Helen Hayes. After appearing in some off-Broadway plays, he wanted to learn more of the dramatic arts, so he took classes on voice, speech, and ballet. Eventually, he was in the touring production of All-American and Wonderful Town. After it finished its tour of the United States and closed its final show in San Francisco in 1962, he decided to just stay and move on up to Los Angeles to pursue roles in television. For the first year, things weren't going that good for him. He couldn't find any work. This is when he realized he needed an agent, and a good one. So he went and found the William Morris Talent Agency, which was the most powerful one at the time. And they didn't just accept any old person. You had to go through several auditions, and they tested you in all aspects of the dramatic arts. They liked what they saw, they signed him to a contract and started to send him out to auditions. In 1964, he got to be on the Joey Bishop TV series, then an episode of The Twilight Zone called I Am the Night, Color Me Black. And then the movie Ensign Pulver, which is actually star-studded. There's a lot of people in that movie. And then he got to go in and audition for a part on The Andy Griffith Show. And of course, George won the part to play Goober Pyle, the cousin of Gomer Pyle, who was played by Jim Nabors, which also grew up in Alabama, but they weren't really cousins in real life. Now on the show for a while, the character Gomer Pyle would sometimes reference his cousin Goober. They never mentioned a last name. So when George finally appeared on the show playing Goober Pyle, there was only one episode which had Goober Pyle and Gomer Pyle in it, and it was called Fun Girls. And the character Andy Taylor, played by Andy Griffith, refers to him as Goober Beasley. But they changed that later on and went with Goober Pyle to make sure it solidified the cousin, relationship there. And from there, the character of Gomer was spun off to have his own show, Gomer Pyle USMC. And from then on, it was Goober Pyle who brought in all the comedic, shenanigans. And he did just that. He was a great addition to the show. He appeared in 86 episodes. He also was in one episode of Goober Pyle USMC, one episode of the new Andy Griffith Show, and then 54 episodes of Mayberry RFD. In 1971, when that show was canceled, he went ahead and put out his own album called Goober Sings. That brought him to the attention of the producers of Hee Haw, which eventually brought him on as a cast member, where he stayed for 20 years. Throughout the years, George was very active with charities. He raised over $1 million for Special Olympics and hundreds of thousands of dollars in his home state for people with mental disabilities. He also opened his own restaurant chain called George Lindsey Steakhouses. Now, I couldn't find a lot of information on these restaurants, but I believe there must have been an awful lot of them because my hometown of Granite City, Illinois, which is Nowheresville, USA, actually had one. Now, I was born in 1971, and I remember my dad talking about a fire in our town that burnt down George Lindsey's restaurant. I asked my sister, who was in high school when I was born, if she remembers anything about it, and she says, "Oh yeah, I remember we ate there before." And I'm like, "Oh wow." And then we were talking about other things, and she said, "Boy, remember when I used to work at Dog and Suds, and they'd drive you up there as a kid?" And I said, "Yeah, I do." And then I go ahead and keep searching for these pictures, and I find a picture of George Lindsey's restaurant attached to a Dog and Suds ad. What a freaky coincidence. And speaking of freaky things, listen to this. In 1962, when he was making his way around Hollywood and not having any luck, one of the roles that he got the closest to was on the TV show Star Trek. It was the role of Mr. Spock. Yeah, it came down to him and Leonard Nimoy. Now, people didn't believe this for the longest time because George never talked about roles that he didn't get. Also, Leonard Nimoy only spoke of this one time in an interview, and he let out a little chuckle at the end, which led people to believe he was just joking. But over the years, more and more people came out and said, yes, they were there when the auditions were happening, and they remember how close it was between the two. And then later on, Ernest Borgnine wrote in his autobiography, "With my hand to God, I swear George Lindsey was almost Mr. Spock on Star Trek, the role that made Leonard Nimoy famous." Now, over the years, George would do guest appearances on television shows like Gunsmoke and MASH. He also would appear in movies like Take This Job and Shove It, Cannonball Run 2, which I love the Cannonball Run movies. And, but mainly he stuck to doing charities, hee-haw, and just living a good life. Sadly, on May 6, 2012, George passed away in Nashville, Tennessee from heart failure. He was 83 years old and was buried at Oak Hill Cemetery in his hometown of Jasper, Alabama. Now, if you know any facts or trivia about any of the characters George played or anything on himself, maybe even the restaurants, leave it down below in the comments. I love to read those. And if you enjoyed this video, hopefully you'll subscribe or watch a few more. At night, I try and watch a classic movie or a couple sitcoms to try and relax me. And every time somebody sparks my interest and I look them up, and I'm back on here with another cool classic.